Sri Lanka's very own ghostly lady of the lake was brutally drowned in Bogambara River by the last king of Sri Lanka, Sri Vikramarajasinghe, on May 17, 1814. 200 years later, she rises from the dead and is back to tell the world her story. This is the story of Kandy's very own Ehelepola Kumarihami. I'm just gonna call her Kumarihami for the rest of the story. Okay, so Kumarihami was the most beautiful and popular woman in the court of Kandy. She was said to be well dressed and always have flowers around her neck when she lived at the Walava. Kumarihami's husband was the first appointed minister of Kandy by the king, and they lived together with their 4 children in this Walava that was overlooking the palace. And Kumarihami was said to always be surrounded by her children on the balcony of this Walava, which was when she first captured the eye of the king, who would sit there and admire her beauty as the balcony was pointed directly at the king's palace. The king would sit and watch and admire her beauty. Her husband at the time was actually away in Sabaragamuwa fulfilling his duties while she was alone with her 4 children. And this is where the trouble first started. So when her husband was away in Sabaragamuwa, he would send these messages to the king. The chief of the messenger service at the time would tamper with the letters that Adhikaram would send to the king while he was in Sabaragamuwa, because Moligoda, who was the chief of the messenger service, had his own agenda. He wanted to take Adhikaram's place instead. So he would lie to the king. He would make up stories about how the Adhikaram wanted to overthrow the king and take his place. And there were also rumors at the time circulating that Adhikaram was indeed in alliance with the British to bring down the king or overthrow the king. So the king believed Moligoda, the chief of the messenger service, and was now out for blood. This is when the Adhikaram, who was Kumarihami's husband, fled Sabaragamuwa and actually began an alliance with the British. This was when the Adhikaram sought refuge with the British, leaving his young family behind in Kandy. And this was when the king found the perfect opportunity to corner the young woman. So when this happened, the king was said to charge into the Walava in the dead of the night, looking for Kumarihami. She opened the door of the Walava and asked the king politely why he was there so late. But the king allegedly caught hold of her hand, attempting to make advances towards her, and she slapped the king, a move that sealed her fate and the fate of her family. King then used her husband's betrayal as an excuse to execute his family. He was said to have threatened her husband by saying that he would kill his young family if he did not return to Kandy immediately. And the king supposedly gave the Adhikaram a week to return before he ordered Kumarihami to pound her children. Her husband knew that regardless of his return, his young family would not be spared. So he didn't return. Kumarihami and her family were then taken to the gallows, and Kumarihami was actually asked to assist in... I'm not gonna talk about what happened with her children because I feel that it's just incredibly cruel and sad what the king did to her children. I mean, I just said that. But I'm not going to go into detail, but her 2 sons were executed. Let me just put it at executed in a very cruel way. Kumarihami and her 2 daughters were then taken to Bogambara River, where stones were tied around their neck and they were pushed into the river with a pole. On May 17, 1814 was when Kumarihami and her 4 young children were executed by the ruthless king. The spot where Kumarihami and her 2 daughters were said to have drowned is apparently where the People's Bank in Kandy is now situated. There is actually a memorial stone and a statue erected where the tragedy once took place. Although this was said to be in retaliation to her husband's betrayal and alliance with the British, her husband was said to move on rather quickly. He remarried the same year with an all-expense-paid wedding by the British. You would think that the story of this tragedy would end here. This story is just beginning. Years passed and the urban legend of the vengeful spirit, the Lady of the Lake, was said to have spread near and far. Spectres would claim to encounter the spirit of a lady looking for her children, vengeful over the kingdom that was responsible for the brutal slaughter of her young family. But as time went on, sightings of the spirit were no longer. The shrieks the town people heard were no longer. Was the vengeful spirit of the Lady of the Lake finally at peace? Answers came in the year 2014, nearly 200 years after her tragedy. 53-year-old Tilaka hailed from Kandy and grew up afraid of large bodies of water. She was a writer and a lecturer and would grow up to have vivid dreams of herself being drowned. As early as aged 9, Tilaka claimed to have knowledge of the afterlife. She would go on to say that she had a feeling of vengeance, but had no knowledge of exactly why she felt vengeful. As she grew older, she met with a lecturer who, upon meeting her that night, had dreams of Tilaka being carried to the lake and being drowned. In the dream, the lecturer was actually an observant spectator at the palace, and when this lecturer told Tilaka about her dream, Tilaka actually said, yeah, I do have the same dream. And apparently this revelation triggered Tilaka's subconscious, triggered her memories to appear more vividly, and thus jogged her subconscious to recall supposed events, what she now calls her past life. Tilaka, who was now a grandmother, would recall events that really went down at her execution. She went on to claim that she was indeed a vengeful spirit that haunted the lake, grieving her children until the 1950s. She was reborn after a ritual had set her free. She surprisingly did not blame the king for the demise of her young family. She would go on to say that it was the advisors of his court who had gone on to sacrifice her family. Upon news of her rebirth spreading, the people of Kandy began sending Tilaka her mementos and belongings of her past, but she would refuse them as the memory of her tragedy was just too painful. So Tilaka is actually very public about exactly what went down and her revelations. She's a writer herself, so she actually wrote about her story on Singhali's media. The full interview is actually on a YouTube channel called Vishwakarma. You can tune in if you would like to know her full story. She goes on to describe the craziest, which is actually a lot different than what history tells us. There is also a movie based on her life. So yeah, that was the story of the Lady of Kandy Lake. Have you heard of this story before? Let me know in the comments.